we are on Facebook now as well.
Okay.
Here, the Rices are here. That's beautiful. The Keiths are here. That's beautiful. At home now, not on the road. But there you go. And it'll be 6 o'clock in a moment. Cheers to your health there, Gary. I'm actually totally delighted that because of the nature of things, having a glass of wine during Bible studies is quite acceptable. Well, it's 6 o'clock, so I'm glad that you're here with me today as we dive into the absurdity and the beauty that is Leviticus. And if you don't find it both absurd and beautiful, hopefully you will by the end. Let's pray. Good and gracious God, as we dive into these ancient words and come to some kind of understanding, may that understanding be given to us by your Holy Spirit that whispers truth of ancient words that can be lived today in such a fashion that we might still become the people you want us to be by looking at things that some think make no sense anymore. Do us that great favor of showing us that all things matter when we pay attention. We pray this in the strong name of Jesus. Amen. All right. Oh, my hair's tied back. That's what's going on. So last week we were in Leviticus 4, and Leviticus 4 changed things up a little bit from the first 3 chapters. Now, in case we're wondering, Leviticus starts right in again to sacrifices with the burnt offering in chapter 1, the grain offering in chapter 2, the peace or / fellowship offering in chapter 3. And then by the time you get to chapter 4, and these offerings are all sacrifices, by the way. By the time we get to chapter 4, where we were last week, it's now talking about offerings that are done in sin. So it was called the sin offering or the purification offering. And again, there's different modes of what people think of, depending on the scholars you read, about what these sacrifices mean. I prefer the modes that talk about how the burnt offerings and the grain offerings and the fellowship offerings are offerings that are joy offerings. Sometimes in the church, I haven't done it recently, but I was including something where I had people offer their joys. And I should probably do that again. I stole that from my last church. They did that. You would have people come up to share their joy, and they'd drop money into what they called the joy box that went to the food closet that the church ran. But yeah, so you'd have to give something to share your joy, but you were giving something that was feeding the hungry. And these are joy offerings. You're excited. Is the idea from others. Now, there's some people who think that all the sacrifices are because of sin, even though the word sin doesn't really show up until the 4th chapter, when we get to the sin offering or the purity. The purity offering there, or the purification offering. And we're going to read chapter 5 and go into chapter 6 today, just a little bit. And it's going to talk about the graded sin offering at the beginning of chapter 5, which is a continuation of the purification offering. And then we're going to get into the guilt offering or the reparation offering that isn't a part of chapter 6. So we're going to get into all sorts of crazy offerings and talk about them. But we moved from joy ones to sin ones. That's one way of looking at it. Or there's another way of looking at it. The burnt offering, the grain offering, and the fellowship offering, there are others who think that these are all offerings and sacrifices that are initially because of sin, some kind of sin that you do. And so you need to make a big offering first. And the big offering or sacrifice moves you to a place of reconciliation with God. And then when you get to the purification offering that we talked about last week, and we'll talk a little bit again this week when we hit chapter 5. The purification offering, well, if you've been reconciled to God, sin and actions and lack of actions and things said and things not said are so important to the priestly writers of Leviticus that, well, things need to be purified when sin touches it. So again, we had last week, if the high priest sins somehow or another, unintentionally, but recognizes that there has been sin, the purification that needs to be done is now for the altar on the outside of the tabernacle and things on the inside of the tabernacle where the high priest goes. Now it's Yom Kippur, where once a year the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was with the 10 Commandments, and they would purify that room as well with the blood of cattle. And that 7 times, which again represents creation, but so the 7 times of purifying, which then brings, which like baptism, purifying the whole of the tabernacle, so that the presence of God may still be there. Sin in the ancient world, well, in almost all of the ancient world until very, very modern times, has always been something that people recognize somehow or another separates people from God. God cannot be around those kinds of things, for God is holy, and God's holiness would destroy us should we not have something. So this recognition first of reconciliation was the burnt offering, the grain offering, and the fellowship offering, and then the purification offering was to purify that. Now that we've reached the place where we are reconciled to God, now the purity must happen. So it happens for some individuals who are not the whole congregation or the high priest, just on the altar outside, because that's the part where they connect with God, and that part they've soiled with their sin. For the high priest and the whole congregation, the inside of the tent of meeting, needs to be purified as well. Does that make even sense as I say it? Or are there any questions with regards to why? Let's just talk about why for a moment. Why on earth does God need things purified because of human sin? I don't know. I wish I did. If I could tell you, then that would all be taken care of. But we just know that there is something with regards to the way that God works that necessitates that when something happens, that there's a cutoff, that God his presence is away. And let's just be honest about some things. How well are people accepting anything coming from institutions that we have always trusted? Does anyone trust the media anymore? Does anyone trust the church anymore? Does anyone trust the politicians anymore? There was a period of time, I think in most of our lives, when there was a fair amount of trust that the population still had in these institutions. Now, granted, I was born after Watergate, but it wasn't like they didn't distrust and hate the other side like they did now. There used to be a time when people who were in the news were trusted, reporters were trusted. And now we don't trust anything that they say. There was a time when the church was trusted, that the church would stand up for such, but it's not even anymore. I mean, if you talk to unchurchy people about the church, the first thing they'll probably mention is something about Catholics and all of their issues with regards to child molestation issues that they've always tried to push under the things. And if we're pondering what all of this is, let's take the church, because we're in a church, kind of. When the church has done things that are sinful, and the church tries to cover it up, and the church doesn't acknowledge that the sin has caused a brokenness with God to a fair degree, because God is a God of justice, because God is a God of compassion, because God is not a God who, like we take some things right now, I mean, you can take the Catholic Church with its history of abuse in terms of child molestation and things of that nature. You can take other forms of churches where we have a history of racial issues that we've yet to get over or even try to do anything about. And has caused now a schism that's going on in the Southern Baptist Convention just a little bit in that way, or in ways that mainline denominations are struggling and have split over the issues of how are gays and lesbians treated in the church and things of that nature. All of these kind of things that are sin. Now, again, people will start to debate, well, what is sin? What's the right sin? These things that are sin have not been addressed. Some have been just pushed right under the things, or we just split the church. And in the midst of doing all of that, we've never dealt with things, and people can no longer find God in the church sometimes when they're seeking God. Why? Because we have decided that sin has no place in our society anymore. We've taken a road, by and large, whereby we say to everybody, do what you want, as long as it doesn't affect me, it's all right. And there was no place for such a life like the one we lead now in Leviticus at the time of Leviticus. Boy, that was hard for me to say twice in a row. And the reason for that was the connection to God, the connection that God had to these people that God redeemed from the land of Egypt and then set up home with. The presence of God was in the tabernacle, and the project that God had for the world was going to begin with the people who would constitute later the nation of Israel. And as Christians, by and large, we still believe this. That's the way God started the whole thing. I've had a lot of atheists tell me that they don't believe in God, and when I ask them why, all but one, and the whole time I've asked atheists about God, and atheists love to talk about God, all but one has commented about how they've been pained by being members of a church because of the way that people treated them in the church. When the church mistreats people and does not confess its sin, it does still cut people off from God, both the people who are already in the church and the people whom the church could bring to God. The priest understood this all the way, because the more we just kind of accept really nearly whatever, blah, 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 since it goes, people get lost in the midst of all of that. And the priest wanted to make sure that people knew that sin mattered. And sin does matter, let's be honest. I know that it's like, we don't like to talk about it because, like, don't judge me. I'm not, you know, Jesus had a lot to say about judgment, and it's not judging, but there's pieces of this that we're going to recognize. So they recognize that in these purification offerings that are needed, the purification offerings are to help remove the sense of things, to know that there's a ritualistic element that allows people to move from the stage of having caused impurity and broken relationship with God to a place where that relationship is restored, the purity is restored, and God can continue to function in the midst of the tabernacle without sin having its way. And this is not just true of the Old Testament, this is true in the New Testament as well. But again, we want to get rid of some of these notions of things because we don't like to talk about it. And part of the reason we don't like to talk about it has a lot to do with, let's take just for instance, how many people talk about how lonely people are these days? I mean, right now we're lonely simply because we're stuck inside. But loneliness before even the pandemic was at all-time highs in terms of how people reported it. We're more connected via the internet than we've ever been before in our lives. And people feel lonelier more than they ever have before. It is possible to exist in our homes, as we well figured out in the midst of the pandemic, ordering everything online and never dealing with another human being face to face. This isn't community, and it's killing us. And part of the way that community continues in a way that is well and honest and just and holy and loving is when the community itself recognizes that things have been broken. But people now, they're like, no, they don't want to deal with any of it. There was none of that in Leviticus. And so how is Leviticus going to be speaking to us about maybe ways that we have from God to try to create a world that doesn't have this brokenness, that doesn't have this sense of isolation? Because isolation, and the sense of isolation, is in fact part of what happens when we have such things like sin continue to take sway. And have you noticed how few people, when they're caught doing something wrong, offer anything like an apology or reparation toward what they've done? Right now, they're just like, okay, I'm sorry, but never talk about it ever again. We're going to find out that there's no room for that in Leviticus either, because Leviticus is going to force people to deal with things honestly and justly, and thereby repair relations that are broken.
You know, I believe that we still are separated from God by sin. And I especially, I mean, I agree with everything you say about the church and whatnot, but I think that where it's the most dangerous or the most insidious is because it separates us individually from God. I am old, but I like one of my favorite parts of the service is a prayer of confession. I want that on Sunday. I mean, I could do that every day, and and I tend to do that more during Lent, but as I'm doing my study, but I realize how separated I have felt without having that part of church. I feel separated.
Well, and otherwise we're just participating. So let's put it this way real quick too. I have always enjoyed especially when I was teaching Mark years ago, and the first time we got to one of the unclean spirits who had possessed some poor unfortunate soul, who sees Jesus in the unclean spirit, causes the person to scream out, "Jesus of Nazareth, what would you have to do with us?" And I asked the question to the people who were in the Bible study with me, and all of them were like, everything. Jesus would have everything to do with us. And that's the right answer. There is literally no part of our lives that does not concern God. Even if we wish that we could compartmentalize our lives to such a fashion where we could have these kind of things where we don't have to worry about what God thinks of it, that's not how God works. And part of the reason that's not how God works is because what we do does not just affect ourselves, it affects all of the relations that we have with others. That's just true. With the past, with the future as well. I mean, if you take just some of the ways with which that we're dealing with the planet at this moment in time. I was talking to a 17-year-old who's going to be preaching to some of the denominational officials of the Disciples of Christ denomination. His father is a friend of mine, and I was talking to his father, and he's like, my son here, he's going to be doing this. He's really nervous. I'm like, I'd be nervous too as a 17. I'm nervous anyway. And gets me on, and I'm like, well, what are you doing? He's using Romans 8, the end of Romans 8, for I am convinced that neither life nor death nor things present nor things to come nor that part will separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. And I was like, well, that's a great passage. What are you going to say about it? What are you focusing on? He said, climate change. And I think to myself, where do you see climate change in there? And I asked him, where do you see climate change in there? He's like, these are people who've been telling me this is what they believe. But they're living in a world where I can't believe that because they're destroying the environment, and my generation is terrified about what's going to happen. So I don't know how they can possibly believe that when they don't seem to be living into it. And I want to ask them how. And only a 17-year-old can preach that sermon. but we've broken through our own ways of dealing with the environment and our lack of dealing with it with the generations that are in front of us. And strangely enough, most of our generations who are before that just don't care. And that is sin.
Yeah.
I mean, what yesterday, a white guy who has a sexual addiction, can't figure it out, killed 8 people, Asian women. Wow. Like, if we're not going to deal with the sin of racism and how we've gone about with sexualizing particularly Asian women in our culture and what that means, and now we're going to have those kind of things, that's sin. It breaks things apart. It breaks these pieces apart. And Leviticus doesn't have any room for us not to deal with it. And worse yet, in the church of Jesus, who is the Christ, you have people who say, I don't want to hear about any of that. I just want to hear the gospel.
That is the gospel.
Exactly. Thank you. That is the gospel. How do people have the audacity to call that the gospel, as though the gospel is the pie in the sky, and that Jesus wasn't walking around saying the kingdom of heaven has broken into the world. It's here right now. Repent and believe in the good news. Get over your bad self. Recognize that you've done something wrong and change your ways. Become more like me. Die to yourself so you can rise again with me. This is a piece of Christianity that's over and over and over again. We're just seeing how God is going about it now. And I have now talked for 21 minutes with you all, and we haven't even read verse 5 or chapter 5, verse 1. And I do want to get into chapter 6. So let's go. I'm going to read. I'm in chapter 5, verse 1. Now, we've talked about so far the sins that happen that are unintentional from the religious leader, from the congregation as a whole, from rulers and what rulers need to do, and from regular people and what regular people need to do. And there's a gradation toward it, because Leviticus recognizes that different people and what they do affects things differently. And again, this is true. When I do something I shouldn't, and I've done a lot of things I shouldn't, it is worse to some degree than when someone who's not in a church at all does something, because I've done it and I am a representative and people think of me as a representative by the sheer nature of my ordination and my call by God. Because of what I've done, I recognize there's something that's worse for God for that, because not only have I hurt myself and others, but I have hurt the relationship between others and God because of what I've done, because they're less inclined to get to God because of what I've done. Now, the same when it comes to rulers of things, whether that be a political ruler or a ruler of anything else. When the CEO of a company does something that's wrong, that's worse for the company than when some employee who works in the evening shift does something. It's just the nature of it. And Leviticus is being honest with that in chapter 4. Now in chapter 5, when any of you sin in that you have heard a public adoration to testify, though able to testify as one who has not seen or learned of the matter, do not speak up. You are subject to punishment. Now, again, if you are being asked to testify or something and you can and you say you can't, you're going to be punished. Now, that just is fair. This is a part of telling the truth. Goes on. Or when any of you touch any unclean thing, whether the carcass of an unclean beast or the carcass of an unclean livestock or the carcass of an unclean swarming thing, and are unaware of it, you have become unclean and are guilty. Now, these are, again, sins that you've done that you're totally unaware of, or maybe you just weren't thinking about it. So if the previous ones were sins of commission, where you unintentionally did something you shouldn't do, these are sins of omission. Where you unintentionally didn't do something that you should have done. So if you touch something that's unclean, you need to get yourself purified, or you shouldn't touch something that's unclean, but you weren't thinking about it, omission. It moves on in verse 3. Or when you touch human uncleanliness, any uncleanliness by which one can become unclean and are unaware of it, when you come to know it, you shall be guilty. Now, again, this idea of guilty is not just that you have done something and you are now guilty as charged, but it is also the sense of internal feelings of guilt. How many people love internal feelings of guilt? Anybody? Just raise their hands up. Love internal feeling? No, no. I mean, like I'm with you. It sucks. And we have devoted a lot of our resources to trying to deal with that psychologically in the last 50 years. And this is something that has been still affecting others. And so basically, Leviticus here is saying, if you do something like not testify to the truth, even though you can, when you learn of it, that you've done this, you're gonna feel guilty because you should have done the right thing, and you're finally, your guilt, your conscience is getting to you. Leviticus is literally saying your conscience will get to you in terms of like, you're guilty now. And have you ever reached one of those things where one day you just remembered something you did 4 years before and you're suddenly feeling guilty even though you'd never thought about it before? That's one of those moments when maybe God would be like, you finally figured out you shouldn't have done that. Guess what? Now you have to repair relationships with me and people and yourself. Good luck. And this is how God's going to do it. He's in this kind of things. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. Verse 4, or when any of you utter aloud a rash oath for a bad or a good purpose, whatever people utter in an oath and are unaware of it, when you come to know it, you shall in any of these be guilty. How many times have we heard somebody say, I swear to God, either in excitement or in fury or something else? Now, I've done this with my children. Like, you know, like they're hammering something back when they were young. I'm like, stop it. And the next thing, I swear to everything that's holy, if you don't stop that right now, okay, now, like, again, good or bad purposes, words are important. We learned that in James, if you were dealing with me in James at all, the importance that James places upon words is now being demonstrated in Leviticus as well, especially if you're going to try to include God in it. This is why Jesus said, do not swear. Let your yes be your yes. Be above reproach. James said the same thing. Here, it's like if you get hot under the collar, and part of the purpose of this too is Leviticus has a sense that those who have a relationship with God, the whole community is supposed to, but particularly an individual kind of one where you recognize this, you will not say things that are rash, whether in good or positive. You have that sense of that kind of monk that just sits there and very kind of monkish and just like, which is one of the reasons, like, while I've trimmed the beard fairly significantly, I miss that sense of, somebody on Facebook said a grizzly guru. I liked that. Like when I forced myself to look more holy, like somebody who's stuck in a cave somewhere, I had a tendency of acting more appropriately. But that idea of being holy is to act the right way, to not say things that are rash, to not speak out of my quick, to shut up. And when those moments hit where I might want to unleash some verbal diarrhea, to stop for a moment and simply let it be. Because again, if you see this, well, then verse 5, when you realize your guilt in any of these, you shall confess the sin that you have committed. And there's the confession. We haven't seen things about confession yet. But confession hits. Confession is important. Confession is one of those things, yeah, you're right, we don't do in the church as much as we used to. But the beauty of confession, well, let's actually just keep reading. We're going to hear it all, then we'll talk about it all. Well, I'm the one reading, so I'll interrupt. And it's hard to interrupt people who are reading on Zoom. Like when I do these in person, like someone will be reading, I interrupt them whenever I want, and it's easy enough. But on Zoom, like, you know, it's harder. So, and one time I muted somebody on Zoom when I wanted to interrupt them, and that was, I felt guilty for that. So when you realize your guilt in any of these, you shall confess the sin that you've committed, and you shall bring to the Lord as your penalty for the sin that you have committed a female from the flock, a sheep or a goat, as a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement on your behalf for your sin. doesn't say much about all of that. You just bring a female, and so it's a different kind of sin than or a different kind of offering than the other offerings, different kind of sacrifice. This is a female goat or sheep. And the reason it says goat or sheep is it's actually just one word in Hebrew, but there's words for goat and there's words for sheep, and then there's words for goat or sheep. And this is the word for goat or sheep. But it's basically like choose one. Doesn't much matter. Verse 7, but if you cannot afford a sheep, you shall bring to the Lord as your penalty for the sin you have committed 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. So these 2 pigeons, if you're doing that too, there's a burnt offering piece and a sin offering piece. They're going to be treated differently. You shall bring them to the priest. You shall offer the first one for the sin offering, wringing its head at the nape without severing it. He shall sprinkle some of the blood of the sin offering on the side of the altar, while the rest of the blood shall be drained out at the base of the altar. It is a sin offering, or a purification offering. You can call these things as well. And the second, he shall offer for a burnt offering according to the regulation. Thus the priest shall make atonement on your behalf for the sin that you have committed, and you shall be forgiven. But if you cannot afford 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, you shall bring as your offering for the sin that you have committed 1/10 of an ephah of choice flour for a sin offering. You shall not put oil on it or lay frankincense on it. This isn't the grain offering. This is a sin offering now, these things. For it is a sin offering. Man, that's what it says. You shall bring to the priest, and the priest shall scoop up a handful of it as its memorial portion and turn this into smoke on the altar with the offerings by the fire to the Lord. It is a sin offering. Thus the priest shall make atonement on your behalf for whichever of these sins you have committed, and you shall be forgiven. Like the grain offering, the rest shall be for the priest. Now, these are the sin offerings or the purification offerings, that when you have something that's unintentional or something you just simply weren't thinking about, those matter. They matter not only for the sanctity of the tabernacle itself, but the future of the congregation's relationship with God. So these aren't things that people talk about sins in such a way, like they have consequences. And again, as we've already talked about, we know this. There's many consequences to these things. And for some, I think partially the fundamentalists of our traditions, and these are all traditions, the fundamentalists really like to talk about sins they can name really easily, which have a lot to do with what you do in the bedroom. It's basically like Christian pornography. Like we're not going to watch it, but we're going to talk all about it when we're there. I heard a sermon one time from a fellow who it was an anti-gay sermon. And by the end of the sermon, it was almost as though he tried to put into everyone who was listening into their head exactly what it was like to witness. It was a fascinatingly abusive on so many levels sermon. All because he was trying to talk about how he thought this was a sin. And so he basically made everybody think about it in a sermon. And I was like, how dare you? And on so many levels. As opposed to sins that are actually destroying things or pieces of that, or sin that we know about, which has a lot more to do with justice. And again, we're going to see that in a second. The next pieces that start in Leviticus 5:14, and we're going to go through Leviticus 6:7. Because by the time we get to Leviticus 6:8, it's going to kind of talk about it's going to reprise the prescriptions for the sacrificial offerings a little bit and speak a bit more from a priestly view. But there's one more kind of like offering that we see here, and this now is the reparation offering. So for the people who...
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
All these different kinds of things you can bring for a sin offering, was there no difference between them? I mean, is some flour the same as a lamb?
No, it's economic reasons. So if you have more resources, you get to give more.
You're
Okay.
expected to give more.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, like, and
They're all
so
equal as far as what they do for you.
they're all equal as far as what they do for you. Yes.
Okay.
Good question. And we see that over and over again too in the grain offerings and the burnt offerings and the peace offerings. Each one of these sacrifices is relational to what someone can afford. So if you can afford the most, you give the most. If you can't afford the most, you give the least. Or is gradations down to that, which is, I mean, think seriously, for 4,000 years ago, ish, 4,000, 3,000 years ago, like this is fairly forward thinking things. And you can see the differentiation now between the purification offerings that we just went into, or the sin offerings, as the NRSV calls it, the sin offerings. But I think the better word would be purification offerings, because that's what the offerings do. And now we're going to get into what the NRSV calls the guilt offering. But I think alternatively, that is much better called the reparation or compensation offering. So if the burnt offerings in the cosmology of those who think all sacrifice is because of human sin, the burnt offerings, the grain offerings, and the peace offerings help bring relationship back with God. That's the welcome back. You can celebrate because you're going back to the house of God. You're allowed to. Now, the purification offerings purify the holy areas so that what sin has done to the holiness is purified. And again, baptism is actually a piece of this. We don't talk about it much, but we claim in baptism that this symbolic washing is purifying us by the Holy Spirit. I mean, we've been doing the same thing for 2,000 years, just in a slightly different way. But people don't like talking about that. We actually don't like talking about the sacraments anymore, which is a shame. But we'll get into some more of those kind of things. So that purification. Now there's a reparation offering. And the reparation here, there's some that you have to give to God, because it's as though when you were out doing what you were not supposed to do, you cost God time as you as a worshiper, time as you as a servant. And you have now to give back to God more than you actually took from God. And we're going to see that reparations are also necessary for how you've treated your neighbors. And we'll see, of course, that this is very familiar for Jesus. This is good stuff. The Lord spoke to Moses in verse 14, chapter 5, saying, when any of you commit a trespass and sin unintentionally in any of the holy things of the Lord. Now, we have no idea what is meant by the holy things of the Lord. Does that mean just all the law? Does that mean how one interacts with the tabernacle? As we go on, I'm going to hypothesize that it has something to do with the law, but it also has a lot to do with justice. If you are acting unjustly, you have in fact committed a trespass against the holy things of the Lord, because the holiness of the Lord demands justice. We'll see that a little bit more. So when you've done any of these things unintentionally, you shall bring as your guilt offering to the Lord a ram without blemish from the flock, convertible into silver by the sanctuary shekel. It is a guilt offering. Now, convertible into silver, there are several hypotheses about what this means. Some people think that it means you can bring silver shekels instead of this ram, like you can pay for it financially. I think that it means that there is, and it actually say here on there, and in verse 16, you shall make a restitution for the holy thing in which you were remiss, and shall add 1/5 to it and give it to the priest. That restitution, that 1/5, you weigh your ram, and the tabernacle has a scale. And when you weigh your ram, it's going to tell you how much that ram is worth in silver. And because of the unintentional sin that you committed against the holy things of God, you now have to give God not just that ram, but 20% of that ram's worth in silver to the tabernacle. Now, there are some scholars who think this didn't come about until the temple period, and it was a temple tax to help make sure that they could actually run the temple because the temple was expensive. Or maybe it just is talking about this idea theologically about when we do something evil, awful. Now, maybe not even awful, or we just do something unintentionally when we hurt somebody. When we desecrate, again, the word desecrate actually says it well. The word desecrate literally means to take away the holiness of something, desacralize something.
Yeah.
We have to give to God. God demands something more from us. It's costly to us because the brokenness was costly to God. And so let's think about the brokenness being costly to God, because sometimes we don't actually think about this. Can you break God's heart?
Sure we can.
Maybe we don't like thinking about the idea of us breaking God's heart, but you can break God's heart. You can actually translate the Hebrew for when God is looking down at humanity before the flood as they have broken my heart. And when you break God's heart, sometimes you have to give God something to, because it's a reparation. You know, it's the difference between, okay, let's put it this way. Anyone ever, now I'm not going to ask because it's supposed to be anonymous kind of things. Anyone familiar with 12-step groups and the 12 steps in 12-step groups?
Kind of.
Kind of.
Yeah.
The 12 steps are Levitical law. The first step of any 12-step groups, and let's just talk about alcohol, is admitting, the first step is admitting you're powerless over alcohol. And then getting to the place in the first couple of steps is then also knowing that you need a higher power to come back to sanity because you don't have any sanity yourself. So you admit you're powerless, and then you admit that you need a higher power, and you're going to give your life to that power. That's the first 3 steps. Now you get to step 4. And step 4 and 5 are not fun steps for anybody because you get to go through a moral inventory of your life. And a part of your moral inventory after you do it is you have to admit to God, to yourself, and to another human being the exact nature of your wrongs. Otherwise, you have to, in other words, you have to confess. And for these 12-step groups, they know that without confession, there is no change. But not just that. After you confess, you now have to make a list of everyone you have harmed. Anyone ever wanted to make a list of everyone they've harmed? I really think everyone should be in the 12 steps occasionally, because it's this kind of the thorough list of everyone we've harmed. And then after we've made a list of everyone we've harmed in these 12 step groups, the next thing one gets to do if they are in them is reach out to everyone they've harmed and try to make amends. Now, you assuming that reaching out to them doesn't make situation worse. The idea is you don't reach out to them if you make this worse. If you're going to harm them or another, don't do it. But if you're not going to harm them or another, you have to reach out to everyone you've harmed. That's a part of the whole thing. That's the steps to go through it to get yourself back to sanity. And this is them reaching out to God, because sin harms God, because it breaks the divine heart, because it's the lack of what God intended for creation. And if you look at creation and what's going on, oh, how it must break the divine heart. I heard a story by Fred Craddock, who, and I know I've mentioned his name before. Fred Craddock passed away maybe 5-6 years ago. He is one of the 5 greatest American preachers of the 20th century, and maybe the best American preacher of the 20th century. But he was a storyteller par excellence. And the rest of us have stories and tell stories. He was actually good at it. Garrison Keillor said he was the best storyteller that he'd ever heard. And in one of Fred Craddock's stories, he talks of one night how he had a dream. And in that dream, he was spending the night at Jesus' house. And Jesus and he, they were just going around the house, and it was lovely. And they were spending time and talking about all these things. And he says in this folksy way, he was raised in the Appalachia of Tennessee back in the Depression. And so he just has this kind of slow, folksy way, a high voice to him. He was told he could never be a preacher because his voice was high and he was small in stature and would have to stand on books sometimes to look over pulpits that were too big for him. And he was like, nah, just going out with Jesus. We're talking about things. It was lovely. It was lovely. And we got time, and it was about time for bed in my dream. And Jesus took me to my room. It was a lovely room. And in that room, Jesus opened up the bed and said, this is where you're going to sleep, Fred. You all right sleeping here? I was all right sleeping there. Thanks, Jesus. Thanks. And he tucks me into bed. It was the most comfortable bed I'd ever been in. I fell right asleep. But I woke up at some point in the night and I heard crying somewhere in the house. And I was just trying to sleep. So I put the pillows over my head in my dream. I'm trying to get the pillows on my head. But the crying was too loud. I put all the pillows on my head, couldn't keep me asleep. So finally I decided to see where I could find the crying coming from. And I peeked out the door to the room that Jesus left me in. And I heard the crying at the end of the hallway. At the end of the hallway, there was a door that was ajar just a little bit. You know how a door can just be jarred just a little bit, just enough for the light to pour in and kind of illuminate the whole hallway, but you can't really see all that much. That's the way the door was. And the crying was coming from the other side of the door. I was like, what's going on down there? And so I walked down and I peek in, and you know how you can just peek in when the door's cracked just a little bit, seeing that. And I saw Jesus. And Jesus was looking out the window of his bedroom and he was crying. And I knocked on the door and Jesus turned and wiped his eyes and said, oh, I'm sorry, Fred, did I wake you? I didn't want to wake you. I didn't want you to hear me crying. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. And I said, well, Jesus, why are you crying? Well, Fred, it's just the world. It's so hard for so many. And I don't have anyone to tell. It makes me cry. And I said to Jesus, well, do you want to tell me? And that's when Jesus looked at me and said, really, Fred? Do you really want to be my friend? Oh, beautiful story. This idea of, do you really want to be Jesus' friend? Do you really want to be God's friend? Do you really want to know what breaks God's heart? So that God isn't alone in it. And this offering, this reparation offering, is to ensure in the ancient world that those ways that you have broken God's heart are repaired. In the Christian world, with substitutionary atonement, that it's fallen out of favor, especially in the mainline denominations to some degree, still is that notion that what Jesus did on the cross, however you want to describe it, whether that he's suffering for all of us, or there's something about the cross, and that something about the cross repairs this relationship, these brokenness, these things that have separated us from God. Now, that doesn't mean that they still can't be broken, that Jesus still doesn't cry, as Fred Craddock said in his sermon. It just means we still need to repent, to acknowledge that we've done something and begin to do the right thing. And that is often the reparation. Verse 17, if any of you sin without knowing it, doing any of the things that by the Lord's commandments ought not be done, you have incurred guilt and you are subject to punishment. You shall bring to the priest a ram without blemish from the flock, or the equivalent as a guilt offering, and the priest shall make atonement on your behalf for the error that you committed unintentionally, and you shall be forgiven. It is a guilt offering. You have incurred guilt before the Lord. That last one, 17 through 19, did you notice that nowhere does the person figure out what sin they've done? They just feel guilty. And in Leviticus, if you just feel guilty and you don't know why, go to the tabernacle, bring a ram, and whatever is making you feel guilty, forgiven. You're repaired. What a freaking joy. I wish I could tell people that in church and they believe it. Because I do, because we say that you're forgiven. People are like, but you don't know what I've done. And I don't care. You can tell me if you need to tell somebody, but you're forgiven. And then there's some people who don't even know what they've done. They just hate themselves. They beat themselves up. This was showing anyone who hates themselves and beats themselves up that there is literally nothing they can do to separate themselves from God. And if they just felt guilty, show up with a ram. I know that seems like a bit, but like if your guilt is keeping you up at night and beating you up, there is a prescription at the end of Leviticus 5 to wipe away your guilt, to make you feel like you can be all right with God. And I wish that people would believe that of Jesus some more sometimes, or just the Christian message. Your guilt's clean, you're wiped away, but man, we beat ourselves up. I'm the king of it. I started my own fan club, just like beatourselvesup.com. You can find it. It's my picture right there. I'll show you all the ways that you can feel guilty for things that you've done for 40 years. And you're just like, God, why am I still worried about the stuff I did when I was 5? Like, get over it. Don't hurt yourself anymore, these kinds of things. And here Leviticus says you don't have to worry about it. You have this free. And I love that. I love that. But we're going to do the next 7 verses of chapter 6 as well. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, now again, this is the Lord talking again this way. When any of you sin and commit a trespass against the Lord by deceiving a neighbor in a matter of a deposit or a pledge, or by robbery, you have defrauded a neighbor, or have found something lost and lied about it. If you swear falsely regarding any of the various things that you may do and sin thereby, when you have sinned and realized your guilt, and would restore what you took by robbery or by fraud, or the deposit that was committed to you, or the lost things that you found, or anything else about which you have sworn falsely, you shall repay the principal amount and shall add 1/5 to it. You shall pay it to its owner when you realize your guilt, and you shall bring to the priest as your guilt offering to the Lord a ram without blemish from the flock, or its equivalent for a guilt offering. The priest shall make an atonement on your behalf before the Lord, and you shall be forgiven for any of the things that one may do to incur guilt thereby. That is wordy. But does it make sense? I'll give a quick Cliff Notes version. If you stole from your neighbor, if you defrauded your neighbor, if you found something that wasn't yours and lied about it, if you swore under oath falsely about those kinds of things, if you have poor business dealings, if you're not dealing the way you're supposed to, guess what? You're a sinner. You've broken relationship with people. And what does God say if you've broken relationship with people? How do you repair that relationship with people? You give it back to them plus 20%. And then and only then do you come to the Lord with your guilt offering. Leviticus has no time for this nonsense of people going to worship God and still defrauding their neighbors, still committing acts of injustice against the poor and the needy and the oppressed. Leviticus has literally no time for that. In fact, Leviticus says, until you make your reparations, don't even bother coming to the tabernacle. Does this sound like anything Jesus said? And maybe, if you remember the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus says, if you come to the altar to present your gift to God, and you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift by the altar and go and repair your relationships with your brother or sister, and only then come back and give your offering to God. and Amos and Micah and Isaiah and Jeremiah, especially. There are in others as well. Habakkuk has some of that kind of way. Hosea is more interested in how people are, but in all of these things, the prophets are saying that the people are not worshiping God the way they're supposed to. They're doing the sacrifices. They're enacting the rituals, but they've broken the ritual from the worship. They do the ritual thinking that that brings them to God. But here, the only thing that can bring them to God, the only thing that makes the ritual work is if first you repair your relationships with those that you've wronged. This is the 12 steps. You see, in the 12 steps, once you've made your amends and you realize that just because you're trying to make them doesn't mean that everybody wants to talk to you. I've made some amends in my time, and I reach out to people, and I've had somebody tell me, I never want to talk to you ever again. That's okay. And I've made amends to some other people that I thought would never talk to me ever again, and we've had lunch, and it was delightful. But if I didn't do that work of making the amends, then none of it would have worked. Once one makes amends and repairs a relationship in these 12 steps, every day, at the end of the day, you have to take a moral inventory of your day and figure out where you failed. And when you figure out where you failed, make the proper steps for amends, reconciliation, and repairing those broken relationships. After you've committed to all of that, only then do you get to step 11 and step 12. And in the Alcoholics Anonymous program, I believe that step 11 is having, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we've decided to increase our conscious contact with God through prayer and meditation, praying only for God's knowledge of God's will for us and the power to carry it out. That 11th step now, having made the confession, having made the reparations, much like we just saw, now they can have conscious contact with God and pray and exist with God in such a way as to know and hope for God's will and the power to carry that out in their lives. And I misquoted that. So if somebody's listening to this later and they'll be like, oh, you need to actually write down the steps when you, yes. Because the step 12 is, having had the spiritual result of the spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we commit to, serve alcoholics everywhere, basically, is the idea, to recognize that we are those who need to help others. And that's why it's called a spiritual program. It's a spiritual program that is very akin to Leviticus. And it's sad that of all the spiritual paradigms that currently exist in the world, the 12-step program is the one that makes Leviticus make the most sense. And it's a 12-step program that people have to get into when they realize that they have broken things severely. And we live in a world where most people never want to admit that they've broken things severely. How many times have we heard people say when they're caught doing something that they've done nothing wrong? Or they want to keep it all private? Notice how this has confession, and whenever anybody sins, and it's not saying who gets to bring it up or who gets to show them, like maybe it's the guilt of the person, they finally acknowledge it, or maybe there's someone in your community who says, you know what you did? That's what happened with David, with Bathsheba. He didn't have any guilt until Nathan went in there and said, hey, I have a story for you. This happened in your kingdom. There was a guy, one sheep, just one sheep. He loved the sheep. It was his only sheep. He used the sheep for all sorts of things. It fed his family and all sorts of things. It kept him warm from all that kind of stuff. They loved the sheep. There's a guy, tons of sheep, lots of sheep, a whole lot of sheep. Had all the sheep he wanted. Saw the guy's sheep who only had one sheep. Decided he wanted that sheep too. Asked him for the sheep. Guy said, no, it's my sheep. I want my sheep. He decided to kill him. Killed him, took the sheep. What are you going to say about that, King David? And David was furious, livid. He wanted to find that person who killed that person and took his one sheep and string him up. And you remember what Nathan said? You are the man. Sometimes we need people who are paying attention to what we're doing to tell us, you are the man, or you're the woman, or you're the person, or the individual. Heck, I don't care. And again, in 12-step things, you have a sponsor whose job is exactly that. When you don't even realize you're messing up, someone who holds you accountable. We don't want to deal with anybody because we don't want to be held accountable. And we're not even sure how to hold other people accountable anymore because we're rarely holding ourselves accountable. This was a situation, and the way that it says over and over again, if anyone sins, anyone means any of them, means pay attention. There was no priest in the ancient world who would respond the way Cain responded to God when God asked where Abel was. And Cain said, am I my brother's keeper? Because right now we exist in a world full of people who say, am I my brother's keeper? Am I my sister's keeper? I'm only concerned about me, thank you very much. I'm not worried about the rest of them. I'll talk about my sin, maybe those are kind of things, but no, like this was a society that was built to be their brother and sister's keeper, where they weren't going to let people be alone. And sometimes they needed to call other people out to make sure that the relationships continued in a way that were healthy and what God wanted and was just. And the justice there too was, you steal from people, you're going to pay them back. Now we see some instances of this with regards to confession and paying people back in Jesus' time as well. You maybe remember the parable of the prodigal son, the one that my daughter calls the parable of the preposterous brothers. Preposterous brothers. It's a hard word to say. I prefer prodigal. It's easier to say for me. Even though I think her title is better. It's more apt for the whole kind of thing. But only he could go back to God when he himself confessed and he was willing to make confession. Maybe we don't pay attention to that. You know the story. He is the younger brother. He demands his share of the inheritance, which is basically saying, Dad, I want you to die. Die right now. And if you're not going to die right now, can you give me my inheritance so I can act like you're dead right now and spend it all? And so he does that. He says, Dad, die. And then he goes, he spends it all. He's now working, feeding pigs, which like for a Jew is like you fall into the very bottom of the wall. And then having been there, it's like even the servants in my father's house are doing better than I'm doing here. Like, let me go back to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired hands. That was his speech. He was practicing it the whole time. His confession to himself in that story is what moved him to a place of reconciliation with the father of the story. And as is the story is all symbolic in the first place, once we realize we have sinned against God and creation and each other, only then, having confessed that, can we move to a place where we are repairing our relationship. We cannot repair relationships with people where we refuse to admit that we've done anything wrong. One of my favorite quotes, and I'll end with this because I realize I've gone over time. I can't even remember who said it. I wish I did. That would be better. But someone once said or wrote, I have seen many promising reconciliations fall apart because while both sides came prepared to forgive, neither side came prepared to be forgiven. We can't accept our need for forgiveness if we're unwilling to admit that we have a need for forgiveness. And there was no way the son in the prodigal son story was going to be able to be forgiven unless he realized he needed to be forgiven. There's been some politicians who made waves a while back who said, I don't need forgiveness. The moment someone says, I don't need forgiveness for anything they've done, there's no way they can actually be forgiven because they're not trying. There's no repair of relationship there. And it's not just the confession, but it's also the reparation. You have to give back. Remember, what was the fellow's name who was in the tree that was short, the tax collector, the short tax collector, starts with a Z. Was it Zacchaeus or Zachariah?
Zachariah.
Zachariah, thank you. Zacchaeus was John the Baptist's father, right? Oh, this looks bad. Okay. I'm deleting this off Facebook when I'm done. Zachariah, when he's up there, and Jesus calls him down and says, I'm eating dinner at your house tonight. And then he eats dinner, and remember, everyone's like, oh, why are you eating with a sinner? But it worked, Zachariah, it worked. He confessed that he had done it, but then he said, I'm going to pay everyone back that I've taken anything from, and I'm going to give them more than I actually stole from them. And then I'm going to give a half of everything else I own to the poor. That's reparations that lead to a new life. And that's when Jesus says, heaven is rejoicing tonight, for salvation has hit this house. It wasn't a salvation because somebody who stole said, I'm baptized now, I'm okay with God. It was a salvation because someone who had broken relationship with God, with others, knew that their whole life was new and they didn't need to live in the old life anymore. And Leviticus has this littered throughout of it. And it's not these esoteric, strange things. It's beautiful, justice-oriented gems that is in this ancient book. And we've turned it into ritual because we don't love our own rituals anymore. But what if I told you every time I do the Lord's Prayer, every time I say that thing, and I like to start it off with a little bit of Aramaic, Abun Bashmaya. Oh, and Jesus started with those words, Abun Bashmaya, which we say, our Father who art in heaven. But Abun, again, is this mother, father kind of thing combined, Abun Bashmaya. And that Bashmaya, and I do it, it makes me feel closer. Or if I do the Lord's Supper, do this in remembrance of me. And every time I've done things that make me feel like I have hurt God, and I'm like, this is my body and it's broken for you. And I'm like, this is my blood and it's poured out for you. And I'm like, this is for me. These are gifts I need. These gifts I need to remember what has happened so that I can be here now. And every time we say, remember your baptism, oh, I'm so grateful for my baptism. And every time I get to baptize someone, I don't know what God is doing in it. That's not the point. God said, do it, so I do it. And when I do it, I know, I feel it, I have it, I know what's going on. The divine is showing up and human beings are being claimed by heaven. And I don't know why it doesn't work that way. I don't think you need it for anything, but simultaneously, I think it matters for everything. Ritual is joyous, and we need to save our rituals from ourselves and recognize all the life that is in them and the majesty that is there, or we will do exactly what the people who just took the ritual without any of the justice. Just dropped my Bible, which is God's way of saying, shut up, Garrett. You've said enough. You're 7 minutes over. People are already listening to Leviticus. Give them a break. Bless you. I love this, and I am truly appreciative that anyone will take time to deal with a 3,000-year-old text of ancient sacrificial systems and rituals that don't make any sense. And yet I am getting to study it and find life. And you taking the time to join me in this discovery of life only makes it all the more joyous. Bless you. And go with God, but I will shut up. Any questions before I turn us off? Well, then blessings, dear souls. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I can't wait until I'm really old so I can tell people, you've made an old man's heart happy, but now you've just made a middle-aged man's heart very happy. So thank you. Have a beautiful rest of your night.
Thank you. That was great.
Well, it was better with you, Linda. Thank you.
Good meeting.
I'm enjoying this.
Well, you know, it takes some strange people to enjoy. It's really quite enjoyable. Like, Gene, you know, you like Rob Bell. Rob Bell started his church in Mars Hill in Grand Rapids, Michigan by preaching Leviticus for a full year. So if Rob Bell can do it, I'm no Rob Bell, but I can do the haphazard version. So amen. Have a beautiful night,
Thank
y'all.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
You.
I